Deep in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, where fog rolls through valleys thick enough to hide entire homesteads, there once stood a property that locals spoke about only in whispers. Before we dive into this chilling tale, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It truly helps the Archive of Fear reach more people who appreciate these dark, historical mysteries. And if this is your first time here, subscribe now, because what I'm about to share will test everything you thought you knew about family bonds and human nature. The year was 1897, and the small logging community of Pinehurst, Washington, was home to barely 250 people. These were hardy souls who made their living from the ancient forests, where Douglas firs grew so tall they seemed to pierce the clouds. It was a place where neighbors might live 10 miles apart, where winter could seal you off from civilization for months at a time, and where secrets could fester in isolation. In the spring of 1887, a man named Theodore Blackwood purchased 300 acres of remote forest land about 20 miles from the nearest settlement. Theodore was a widower in his 40s, stern-faced and taciturn, who had made his fortune in timber speculation back east. But he came west for reasons he never fully explained, bringing with him his 2 children, twins named Cordelia and Nathaniel, who were just 3 years old when they arrived. Theodore built his home with his own hands, a massive 2-story structure fashioned from the very trees he felled. The house sat in a natural depression, surrounded by hills on 3 sides, making it invisible from any main road or trail. It was as if he'd chosen the most hidden spot he could find, a place where the outside world simply couldn't reach. The twins grew up in near-complete isolation. Theodore homeschooled them using books he'd brought from the East, volumes on philosophy, natural science, and peculiarly, several texts on heredity and bloodlines that had belonged to his father, a physician who'd held controversial views about human breeding. Cordelia and Nathaniel were unusual children from the start. Both had coal-black hair and pale green eyes that seemed almost luminescent in certain light. They were inseparable, often completing each other's thoughts and developing their own private language of gestures and glances that excluded even their father. The few times Theodore took them into Pinehurst for supplies, people noticed how the twins seemed uncomfortable around others, how they clung to each other and regarded strangers with a mixture of fear and disdain. After an incident in 1895, when some local boys mocked Cordelia for her odd manner of speaking, Theodore decided his children didn't need the outside world at all. By 1904, Cordelia and Nathaniel were 20 years old. Theodore had begun to notice changes that deeply troubled him. The twins spent hours locked away in the attic, poring over their grandfather's old medical texts. They developed rituals that seemed designed to exclude him. Midnight walks through the property, whispered conversations that stopped the moment he entered a room. One morning in June, Theodore discovered something that shook him to his core. He found diagrams the twins had drawn, intricate family trees that traced bloodlines back generations, with notations about physical characteristics, intelligence, and what they called purity of lineage. When he confronted them, Cordelia and Nathaniel sat him down calmly and explained their decision. They had concluded through their studies that the Blackwood bloodline was special, superior even, and that the only way to preserve its purity was through their union. They intended to marry each other. Theodore's protests fell on deaf ears. The twins had thought everything through. They were of legal age, the property was remote enough that no one need ever know, and they'd found historical precedents in ancient royal families. When Theodore threatened to expel them, Nathaniel coldly pointed out that they were co-inheritors of the property, and that Theodore was growing old and increasingly dependent on them for physical labor. The ceremony happened on a gray morning in July 1904, performed with no official sanction, just the 3 of them and a self-written vow. Theodore stood witness, feeling as though he were watching something fundamentally wrong unfold, powerless to stop it. After the ceremony, the atmosphere in the Blackwood house changed. The twins moved into the master bedroom together, and Theodore found himself gradually pushed to the margins of his own home. They installed locks on certain rooms, began making trips to distant towns for mysterious supplies, and started construction on something in the cellar, a project they refused to let Theodore see. In the spring of 1905, Cordelia gave birth to their first child. Theodore was not allowed in the room during the delivery, but he heard the screams, and then a silence that lasted far too long before the baby's cry finally came. When he was finally permitted to see the infant, a boy they named simply First, Theodore understood why the twins had been so secretive. The child had unmistakable deformities, a malformed spine that created a pronounced curve, hands with webbed fingers, and eyes set slightly too far apart. But what horrified Theodore most was the parents' reaction. Instead of grief or concern, they examined the child with clinical detachment, measuring limbs, noting every irregularity, writing everything down in leather-bound journals they kept locked away. Over the next 4 years, 3 more children were born. Each pregnancy was shrouded in secrecy. Each birth kept hidden from Theodore until days or weeks afterward. The children, numbered rather than named, displayed varying degrees of abnormality. The second seemed physically normal but never developed proper speech. The third had severe facial deformities. The fourth appeared healthy initially but developed seizures and never learned to walk. In the winter of 1906, Theodore finally discovered what the twins had been building in the cellar. Waiting until they were away on a supply run, he broke through the locked door. What he found would haunt him forever. The cellar had been divided into individual cells, each barely larger than a closet, with heavy wooden doors and small barred windows. The rooms contained only thin mattresses, buckets, and chains mounted to the walls. It was clear these rooms were meant to confine someone, or several someones. In one room, he found notebooks filled with observations. The twins had been documenting everything about their children. Feeding schedules, responses to isolation, physical development, mental capacity. They were treating their own offspring as experimental subjects in some twisted study of heredity. Theodore confronted them upon their return, but Cordelia and Nathaniel were unmoved. This was science, they claimed. They were documenting the effects of concentrated bloodlines, gathering data that would prove their theories about genetic purity. The children's suffering was regrettable but necessary for the greater understanding they were pursuing. In the fall of 1908, a trapper named Jakob Reinhardt began noticing odd things about the Blackwood property. Jakob was a German immigrant who knew every inch of the Cascade forests, and he'd started finding strange signs: disturbed earth in unusual patterns, the smell of lime used for decomposition, and occasionally sounds drifting from the direction of the Blackwood house that didn't match any animal he knew. Jakob made his first visit to the property in October, claiming he was tracking a wounded elk. The twins received him with forced hospitality, but Jakob's experienced eyes caught details they couldn't hide: reinforced doors on interior rooms, windows that had been boarded up from inside, and most tellingly, scratch marks on a cellar door that looked like they'd been made by human fingernails. When Jakob asked about children, he'd heard rumors of births. The twins claimed the children had died in infancy, a common tragedy in those times. But Jakob had seen the tracks of small feet in the mud near the cellar entrance, fresh tracks that couldn't be explained away. Jakob left that day determined to learn the truth, but he made a fatal mistake. He underestimated how far Cordelia and Nathaniel would go to protect their secret. Jakob Reinhardt vanished in late November 1908. His dog returned to town without him, and a search party found his rifle and pack abandoned about a mile from the Blackwood property. But they found no sign of Jakob himself. When questioned, the twins expressed appropriate concern and even joined the search efforts. Their performance was convincing enough that initially, no one suspected them. Jakob's disappearance was attributed to a bear attack or a fall into one of the many ravines that cut through the mountains. But Theodore knew better. He'd seen the twins cleaning bloodstains from the cellar floor. He'd noticed fresh digging in the forest behind the property. And he'd seen something else, a terrible satisfaction in their eyes, as if they'd successfully eliminated a threat to their work. Cordelia gave birth to 3 more children between 1909 and 1912. By now, Theodore had been effectively imprisoned in a small room on the 2nd floor. The twins brought him food and water, but he was forbidden from leaving or having any contact with the children. From his room, Theodore could hear the sounds that haunted his nightmares. Children crying in the cellar, the scratch of small hands on wooden doors, and occasionally, screams that were abruptly silenced. He tried to keep a record by scratching marks into the wooden floor, counting days, tracking patterns, creating a testimony of the horror unfolding below him. The twins continued their documentation with obsessive precision. They tested different conditions, varying amounts of light, different feeding schedules, periods of isolation versus forced interaction. They were conducting experiments on human development using their own children as subjects, all in service of their theories about bloodline purity. Dr. Samuel Ashworth had been the physician for Pinehurst since 1898. A thoughtful man trained at a prestigious Eastern medical school, he'd been troubled by the Blackwood situation for years. He'd delivered the first 2 children before the twins banned him from the property, and he'd noted concerning physical abnormalities that suggested consanguinity. When Jakob Reinhardt disappeared, Dr. Ashworth began connecting trouble in pieces. He reviewed his records and realized that based on Cordelia's pregnancies, there should be at least 6 children at the Blackwood property, yet he'd never seen more than 1 or 2 at any time, and never recently. In March 1913, Dr. Ashworth decided he had a moral obligation to investigate. He rode out to the Blackwood property on a cold spring morning, carrying his medical bag and a growing sense of dread. His horse was found 2 days later, still saddled, grazing near the Blackwood property boundary. His medical bag was discovered in the underbrush, its contents scattered as if dropped in haste, but of Dr. Ashworth himself there was no trace. The Sheriff Acts, 1913. Sheriff William Crawford had been avoiding the Blackwood situation for years, like most people in Pinehurst. But with 2 disappearances and mounting pressure from families of the missing men, he could no longer ignore his duty. On March 28, 1913, Sheriff Crawford rode to the Blackwood property with 3 deputies and a county official. They carried a warrant authorizing a full search based on suspicion of foul play. The twins met them at the door with unsettling calm, as if they'd been expecting this moment. Nathaniel simply said, "Finally, now perhaps people will understand what we've accomplished." What Sheriff Crawford found in the Blackwood house would become legendary in the darkest sense of the word. In the cellar, they discovered 5 children, ranging in age from approximately 4 to 9 years old. All showed signs of severe neglect and abuse. They were malnourished, covered in sores, and displayed psychological trauma so severe that several deputies broke down at the sight. The oldest, a girl of about 9 with physical deformities, had been kept in a cell barely 4 feet square. She couldn't stand upright and had developed a curved spine from years of confinement. When the door was opened, she scurried to the corner and made sounds that weren't quite human. Years of isolation had robbed her of normal speech. An 8-year-old boy, physically normal but mentally stunted, rocked constantly and responded to no communication. He'd been isolated for so long that he'd forgotten how to be human. 2 younger children, both girls with varying deformities, cringed from any human touch. They'd been conditioned through punishment to respond to specific signals. Certain knocking patterns meant food, heavy footsteps meant retreat to corners, silence meant danger. The youngest, a boy of about 4, was the most heartbreaking. He'd never seen sunlight, never heard a kind word, never known anything but the cellar cell. When they brought him into daylight for the first time, he screamed at the brightness and tried desperately to return to the darkness, the only world he'd ever known. But the most chilling discovery was in a sealed room at the far end of the cellar. There, Sheriff Crawford found the remains of 2 children, their small bodies showing signs of neglect and starvation. The twins had documented their deaths in their journals with the same clinical detachment they'd applied to everything else. Subject 3 expired on day 47 of nutrition restriction study. Subject 5 demonstrated insufficient resilience to environmental stress testing. In an attic room, they found Theodore Blackwood, now 68 years old and broken in body and spirit. He was emaciated, filthy, and on the edge of complete mental collapse, but he was still lucid enough to tell his story. Theodore had been a prisoner for nearly 5 years. He'd tried repeatedly to escape or seek help, but the twins had caught him each time, eventually deciding the safest course was permanent confinement. He'd been forced to listen to the sounds from the cellar, knowing his own grandchildren were suffering, but powerless to help them. The testimony Theodore provided, combined with the twins' own meticulous journals, painted a picture of horror that shocked even hardened lawmen. This wasn't a case of ignorant neglect or impulsive cruelty. It was systematic, documented, methodical torture justified by pseudo-scientific theories about bloodline purity. A thorough search of the property revealed evidence of Jakob Reinhardt's fate. His body was buried in the forest, along with Dr. Ashworth and one other person they identified as a traveling surveyor who'd gone missing in 1911. All three had stumbled upon the truth and paid with their lives. The twins' journals documented these murders with the same cold precision they applied to everything. Eliminated security threat, disposal successful, research continues unimpeded. The trial of Cordelia and Nathaniel Blackwood drew crowds from across Washington state and beyond. Newspapers dubbed them the Blood Purity Twins and the Mountain Monsters. What made the trial particularly disturbing was the defendants' complete lack of remorse. They genuinely believed they'd been conducting important scientific research. Cordelia testified calmly about their methodology, their hypotheses, their findings. She seemed frustrated that people couldn't understand the importance of their work. Nathaniel was even more chilling. When asked about the suffering of his children, he responded that all scientific progress requires sacrifice, that their discomfort was unfortunate but necessary for the advancement of knowledge about human heredity. The defense attempted to argue insanity, bringing in experts who testified about the psychological effects of isolation and inbreeding. But the prosecution demonstrated that every action had been calculated, planned, and executed with clear intent. The twins knew their actions were illegal. That's why they'd hidden them. They'd murdered people to protect their secret. This wasn't insanity, it was evil. The verdict came quickly. Guilty on multiple counts of murder, child abuse, and false imprisonment. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. The 5 surviving children faced grim futures. Years of abuse had caused damage that could never be fully healed. The oldest girl never learned to walk properly and spent her life in institutional care, dying at age 24 from complications of her malformed spine. The boy with mental retardation showed some improvement with patient care, learning basic communication and simple tasks, but never developed beyond the cognitive level of a young child. He died in a state institution at age 32. The 2 younger girls both suffered from severe psychological trauma. One developed violent episodes and had to be permanently institutionalized. She died at 19 from self-inflicted injuries during a breakdown. The other showed more promise initially, learning to speak and interact, but she could never escape the nightmares of her early years. She took her own life at age 28. The youngest boy, the one who'd spent his entire life in the cellar, never fully adapted to the world outside. He was terrified of open spaces, unable to form attachments to caregivers, and plagued by phobias that made normal life impossible. He died during a panic attack at age 16, his heart simply giving out from the terror that had become his constant companion. Theodore Blackwood never recovered his sanity. He was committed to a state asylum where he spent his final years reliving the horrors he'd witnessed. He died in 1917, still haunted by the sounds of children crying in the cellar. Cordelia and Nathaniel were separated immediately after sentencing, sent to different prisons to prevent any further collaboration. Even apart, they remained unrepentant. Cordelia spent her time in prison writing treatises about heredity and bloodline purity, trying to justify her actions through pseudo-scientific reasoning. She died in 1938 at age 54 from tuberculosis, maintaining until her final breath that history would vindicate her methods. Nathaniel lived longer, surviving until 1956. He spent nearly 43 years in prison, during which he never expressed remorse, never asked for forgiveness, never acknowledged that his children had been victims rather than research subjects. Even as an old man, he would tell anyone who'd listen that he'd been ahead of his time, that his research had been valuable, that society simply wasn't ready to understand. The Blackwood property was seized by the state and eventually destroyed. In 1921, the house mysteriously burned to the ground. Official reports called it an accident, but many locals believed it was deliberate. Some horrors are too great to allow any physical reminder to remain. The bodies of Jakob Reinhardt, Dr. Samuel Ashworth, and the surveyor were given proper burials. The 2 children found dead in the cellar were laid to rest in unmarked graves in Pinehurst Cemetery, remembered by no one but those who knew the dark history. Today, the site where the Blackwood house once stood is barely visible, reclaimed by the forest that had helped hide its secrets for so long. Hikers who stumble across the location report feeling an overwhelming sense of unease, a heaviness in the air that makes them want to leave quickly. Old-timers in what remains of Pinehurst, now largely a ghost town itself, will sometimes speak of the Blackwood case as a cautionary tale. It's a reminder of what can happen when isolation meets obsession, when pseudoscience justifies the unjustifiable, when family bonds twist into something monstrous. The case raised troubling questions that echo even today. How many other secrets might be hidden in remote places? What happens when isolation removes the social checks on human behavior? And perhaps most disturbing, how can people commit such horrors while remaining convinced they're doing something important, even noble? The Blackwood case influenced changes in how isolated families were monitored by authorities in Washington state. Laws were passed requiring periodic welfare checks on children in remote locations, though enforcement remained difficult given the vast distances and limited resources. The case also became a touchstone in early 20th century discussions about eugenics and the dangers of pseudo-scientific theories about human breeding. While some misguided intellectuals of the era promoted ideas about racial purity and controlled breeding, the Blackwood horror showed where such thinking could lead when taken to its logical extreme by true believers. Medical professionals used the case as an example of the severe consequences of consanguinity, not just the physical deformities that can result, but the psychological impact on children born from such unions, and then subjected to abuse by parents who saw them as experiments rather than human beings. Despite the extensive documentation the twins left behind, questions remain. The journals reference earlier subjects that were never accounted for. Were there other children who died before 1913? The twins never answered this question, and excavations of the property in the 1920s found no additional remains, though the vast forested acreage made a complete search impossible. There are also hints in the journals of correspondences with others who held similar beliefs about bloodline purity. Did the twins have contacts who encouraged or enabled their actions? These letters, if they existed, were never found. It's possible they destroyed them before their arrest, or perhaps they were hidden somewhere on the property and lost when the house burned. Looking back at the Blackwood case from our modern perspective, we can recognize the warning signs that were missed or ignored. The extreme isolation, the strange beliefs about heredity, the secrecy around the children, the disappearances of people who got too close to the truth. But we must also acknowledge that similar situations can still occur today. Isolation takes many forms. It's not always geographic. Families can be isolated by religious extremism, by cultural barriers, by economic factors that keep them hidden from social services, or by deliberate choices to separate from mainstream society. The case reminds us that we have a collective responsibility to watch for signs of abuse, to question situations that don't seem right, to act on our concerns, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. Jakob Reinhardt and Dr. Ashworth paid with their lives for trying to uncover the truth. But how many more children might have suffered if they hadn't raised the alarm that eventually led to Sheriff Crawford's investigation? Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Blackwood case is that the 5 children who survived never really escaped. They carried the scars, physical, mental, and emotional, for their entire lives. They never knew normal childhoods, never experienced unconditional love, never had the chance to discover who they might have become without those years of abuse. The case files contain heartbreaking details about their struggles to adapt to normal life. Simple things that most people take for granted, sunlight, kindness, freedom of movement terrified them. They'd been so thoroughly broken by their early experiences that healing was impossible. It serves as a stark reminder that child abuse doesn't just affect the immediate moment, it shapes entire lives, limiting potential, causing ongoing pain, and in the case of the Blackwood children, ultimately contributing to their premature deaths. The Blackwood legacy stands as one of the darkest chapters in Pacific Northwest history. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. That intelligence can be twisted to justify cruelty, that family bonds can become chains of abuse, that isolation can allow evil to flourish unchecked. In the forests of Washington, where the fog still rolls through valleys and the trees grow thick enough to hide secrets, the memory of the Blackwood property lingers. It serves as a reminder that the most dangerous monsters don't hide under beds or lurk in dark alleys. They sometimes live in seemingly ordinary homes, conducting their horrors behind closed doors, convinced that their actions serve some higher purpose. The story of Cordelia and Nathaniel Blackwood and the children who suffered under their care should never be forgotten. It stands as a warning across generations. Evil often doesn't announce itself with theatrical cruelty. Sometimes it arrives dressed in the language of science, cloaked in theories about improvement and progress, justified by cold logic that has lost all connection to basic human empathy. As we close this chapter of Archive of Fear, remember that these dark histories exist not to traumatize, but to educate. They remind us to question, to care, to act when we see something wrong. They teach us that silence and inaction can be as dangerous as active cruelty. The mountains keep their secrets, but some stories demand to be told, not for entertainment, but as solemn warnings from the past about the depths to which humanity can sink when conscience is abandoned and isolation provides cover for the unthinkable. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's darkest corners. If you found this investigation compelling, please subscribe to Archive of Fear and hit that notification bell. We explore forgotten tragedies and mysterious cases every week. Share this video with others who appreciate deep dives into historical mysteries, but perhaps not right before bedtime. Let me know in the comments. What other isolated communities or forgotten cases would you like me to investigate? Your suggestions help shape the content of this channel, and there are countless dark corners of history still waiting to be brought into the light. Until next time, remember that the past never truly stays buried, and sometimes the most important thing we can do is make sure these stories are remembered, so their lessons aren't lost. This is Archive of Fear, reminding you that truth is often stranger and darker than fiction.